Imagine yourself knee-deep in warm mud before the sun has fully risen. The earth clings to your ankles like wet bread. The morning mist hasn't lifted, and yet the heat already presses against your skin, promising another blistering day. Around you, the sounds of tools clanking, ropes creaking, and the low groans of men waking up form a kind of slow, miserable rhythm. The rhythm of labor that began before you and will continue long after. Good evening. You're listening to Boring Boris, Boring History for Sleep, a quiet place where the past moves slowly, the voices are calm, and even the grandest of empires whispers you to sleep. Tonight we begin with mud, stone, and forgotten backs. Now breathe and let the silence between words carry you. You are a laborer, or maybe a soldier, or a prisoner. The distinction doesn't matter anymore. You build for Rome, or at least you help. Your hands are split from stone, your back curves slightly forward even when you sleep. Your shift starts before daylight and ends when the overseer shouting. On good days, you carry wood. On bad days, volcanic sand. On worse days, you lift wet concrete. The Roman kind. The kind that hardens underwater and clings to your arms like a second skin. The construction site stretches further than you can see. Long trenches have been carved into the ground with eerie precision, as if the gods themselves drew the plans. Piles of rock sit in quiet mounds, some neatly cut, others waiting for shaping. There are beams brought in from distant forests, oxen wheezing as they haul carts too heavy for their legs, and all around men like you, stripped to the waist, breathing through dust, trying not to think about the heat or the distance home. The man in charge walks past you often. He does not carry stone. He carries a stylus and a wax tablet. His hands are clean, his tunic too. He speaks of angles and drainage, of foundations and curvature. You don't understand most of it, but you know the tone. Confident, fast, with no room for argument. He speaks to others who also wear clean sandals and clean linen. One of them said today would be important. They were mixing pozzolana, the black sand from near Mount Vesuvius, a special order. When that sand is added to the mix, something changes. The mortar bubbles slightly. It smells faintly metallic. You've seen it poured into wooden molds and come back days later to find it solid, smooth, unyielding. Last week, a test block was dropped from shoulder height. It didn't crack. The same wouldn't be true for your bones. You remember your first day. You thought you would be building walls or hammering nails, but the work is slower than you imagined. It begins
underground. Ditches must be leveled, gravel laid in layers, every layer soaked, pressed, and measured again. Only then comes the stone, only then the mortar, and only after that the weight of arches, columns, and roofs. You've been here for 7 weeks and haven't seen a single arch.
The sun climbs higher. Shadows disappear. Your tunic is soaked, but you keep it on to shield your shoulders. The dust gets everywhere, in your eyes, your mouth, your sleep. Some of the older men tie strips of cloth over their faces, but most don't bother. You can tell who's been here longer by the curve of their backs, the color of their coughs. Midday. A thin bowl of lentils, stale bread, a half cup of water that tastes faintly of metal. No one talks. Talking wastes air. By the afternoon, the pace slows, not because anyone tells you to, but because bodies begin to fail. You drop a stone too hard, and it lands on your foot. The pain is sharp and direct, but there is no pause. You limp back for another. The man next to you vomits in the trench and keeps working. Someone dies every few days, collapses from heat, from infection, from nothing you can see. They're taken away on a cart, and no one says much. There's no ceremony, just less noise. At night you lie on straw. The roof above you leaks. The man 2 spots over cries in his sleep. Somewhere far away, dogs bark. You hear laughter from the officers' quarters. They have wine tonight. You wonder how long this structure will take. You heard one man say it would be 3 years. Another said 5. Someone else said forever. The next morning, it begins again.
Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a construction site that stretches as far as your eye can see. The air is thick with dust. The sun is still low, but already hot enough to sting your skin. Wooden scaffolds rise in strange shapes above you, not quite buildings, not quite ruins, somewhere in between. The foreman's voice barks from a distance. Today, everything must move faster. A delegation is coming. No one says who, but the message is clear. The walls must be up, the arches stable, the entrance cleared of debris. Deadlines in Rome are sacred. They are set by men in togas, far from the heat and stone, and they do not move. You've worked on many sites by now. A bathhouse in one town, a triumphal arch in another, a villa for a senator's mistress.
Each had its own promises, its own political theatre to perform. The stones were not just stone, they were favours, bargains, propaganda set in marble. You remember the day the plans changed mid-project. An inscription was added, a portico too. The architect claimed it would impress the governor. You and 30 others worked through the night, dragging columns into place by torchlight. One man fell. The body was taken away before sunrise. The portico was finished on time. Speed is everything. Faster builds mean promotions, praise, money. Delays mean shame. And shame in Rome carries consequences. Exile, loss of contract, or worse. You've seen architects dismissed for mere hours of delay. You've seen crews replaced entirely when a shipment of travertine didn't arrive on time. No one wants to hear about the weather, or the terrain, or that concrete doesn't dry faster just because a senator says so. Mistakes happen. Of course they do. Foundations laid too hastily. Arches misaligned. Cisterns that leak. But the public will never know. By the time the ribbon is cut, the cracks are hidden behind plaster and paint. The crowds cheer. The officials smile. The wine flows. Then everyone forgets. Except you. You remember every corner that wasn't square. Every column that leaned just slightly to one side. Every shortcut ordered by someone who would never lift a stone in his life. You carry those memories in your back, in the knots in your shoulders, in the dreams where walls fall slowly toward you and you can't move. There's no glory in rushing stone, and yet Rome insists. The very image of empire depends on illusion, on cities transformed overnight. A quiet square becomes a temple courtyard. A muddy field becomes a marketplace. As long as it looks finished from the steps of a palanquin, the truth underneath doesn't matter. But you know the truth. You've seen it poured and patched. You've lived beneath it. You've smelt the lime that wasn't cured properly. You've stood under ceilings that vibrated slightly in the wind. They say the baths of Caracalla took over a decade to complete. But even there, deadlines pushed limits. Craftsmen were brought in from across the empire. Materials rushed from distant quarries. At one point, you're told, More than 5,000 men worked simultaneously, and still the pressure remained, because even emperors grow impatient. When a Roman deadline arrives, there is no extension, only consequences. Someone always pays, if not in money, then in blood. You finish your shift late. The sky is orange. Your arms feel hollow, like they belong to someone else. You walk past a carved inscription laid earlier that day, finished ahead of time by the grace of the emperor. You know it's not true. The mortar beneath it is still wet. Imagine yourself hauling a slab of limestone across a field of loose gravel. It isn't the weight that breaks you, it's the repetition. The same rope, the same rhythm, the awkward lean of your shoulder as you drag another block toward a site you still don't fully understand. You're told it will be a basilica, or maybe a granary. It doesn't matter. You won't be here when it's finished, but the tools will be. They say Roman engineering was ahead of its time, but few remember how much of it was built with tools that punished the body. You've used many. The libella, to check if walls were level. The groma, to mark precise angles for roads or buildings. The chorobates, a massive leveling frame filled with water that shifts with the slightest breeze. Each one was clever, precise, and unforgiving. The libella is simple, a wooden frame shaped like an inverted T with a string and a weight at its center. When the string hangs perfectly vertical, the base is level. But your hands shake. The wind moves the line. The ground settles differently each hour. You hold your breath, watching the string still itself. It doesn't. You reset the block. The groma feels like magic to outsiders, but for you it's just another awkward frame to balance in uneven terrain, trying to align two distant points across hills and dust. The ropes twist, the plumb lines sway, and the man behind you, waiting to mark the next post, curses under his breath because you're not fast enough. Then there's lifting. Small stones go by hand. Medium ones are rolled on logs or dragged on greased planks. But the big ones, those require timber cranes, polyspaston and trispaston systems, the engineers call them. A combination of pulleys, wheels, counterweights, and shouting. It takes 10 men to turn the capstan, straining with each rotation to lift a block a few feet. If the pulley jams or the rope snaps, the stone drops fast and without mercy. There are no safety rails, no harnesses, no second chances. Once, a pulley sheared off and the rope lashed across the site like a whip, breaking a man's arm and nearly taking another's eye. The crane was rebuilt, the men were not. You wrap your hands in strips of linen to avoid splinters from the ropes. The fibers bite anyway. On colder mornings, your grip slips. On hotter ones, the sweat makes everything slick. One slip and a stone that took a week to quarry can shatter, or worse, crush a foot. The pickaxe, the dolabra, is your closest companion. Not elegant, but honest. You use it to break ground, to shape rough stone, to pry loose something stubborn. After hours of use, the handle grows smooth with sweat and friction. You learn to feel when the head is loose, when the binding needs adjusting. You've seen men swing it wrong and take a chunk out of their shin. You've seen others hit something too hard and snap the iron clean off. Even the measuring tools demand silence. The chorobates, a 5-meter-long wooden bench used for large leveling tasks, works by watching water in a channel. But the water quivers with each footstep. The slightest noise, the smallest tremor in the ground, and the readings go off. You wait and wait, holding your breath, hoping the sight will stay still long enough to finish a measurement. It rarely does.
There's a strange respect among the men for the tools. Not reverence, just acceptance. The tools are brutal, but they are honest. They do not pretend to care about your fatigue, your wounds, your hunger, but they don't lie. A misaligned block will reveal itself immediately. A poorly tied rope will fail in front of everyone. A crooked arch will not stand. And so you trust them, even when they hurt you. At night, some men sharpen their chisels in silence, rubbing stone against stone. Others pick at the iron heads of their hammers, looking for cracks. A broken tool is dangerous, but even worse, it stops the work. And stopping the work brings consequences. You once saw a man blamed for a fault that wasn't his, a defective plumb line made from flawed cord led to a misaligned vault. No one believed his explanation. He was flogged. The next day, the supervisor used a different cord. These aren't tools made for the comfort of their users. They're designed for the certainty of results. That's what Rome demands. A wall that stands. A road that runs straight to the horizon. A column that holds. If 10 men break in the process, so be it. You start to notice something strange after years of this. The worse the tool is for your body, the more likely it is to last. The best ones leave you with blisters and bent fingers, but they do their job. Stone after stone, wall after wall.
Long after your name has faded from the ledger, your handprint remains in the smooth face of a slab, the perfect curve of an arch, the silence of a crane that held. And maybe that's the only legacy you get. Imagine yourself kneeling in a shallow trench, elbows deep in mud that smells faintly of iron and ash. You're smoothing out a layer of crushed stone with a flat board. Not because someone told you to, but because you've learned through repetition that if this layer isn't perfect, the wall above will crack. You're not an engineer. You've never drawn a plan, but you know what works. That's the quiet secret of Woman construction. The genius wasn't always at the top, in the scrolls, in the tablets, in the commands shouted from shaded tents. It was often down here, in the dust, in the hands of men with no names on monuments. The men who didn't theorize how an arch distributes weight, but who could feel, just by the tension in a rope, when the keystone was ready to be placed. You've worked under engineers who quoted Vitruvius, but couldn't tell Pozzolana from sand. You've seen foremen who insisted on triple-checking calculations, while ignoring the fact that a wooden beam left in the rain is already beginning to warp. You've been told to build things that you knew just by sight, by feel, by instinct would not hold. And sometimes you disobey, quietly, carefully. You add a second layer of gravel under a wall, even if it's not in the plan. You widen the base of a pillar by a finger's width. You adjust the slope of a drainage ditch by half a degree. You never tell anyone, but the structure stands. No one thanks you, but you do it anyway. The older men, the ones with curved spines and joints that click when they move, they're the real books. They know where to dig when the soil smells too sweet. They can tell, just by the sound of a stone tapped with a hammer, whether it will fracture under weight. One of them once showed you how to bind ropes with wet leather so they would shrink and tighten when dry, stronger than nails. You've never read that in any manual. There's an art to watching, too, to seeing how materials behave. Wet cement should move like thick porridge. Too dry, and it won't bind. Too wet, and it will sag. A good craftsman knows this before it touches the mold. He knows the way the color darkens at the edges when it's about to set. No ruler can tell you that. No architect's diagram. Then there are the stone cutters, the ones who shape blocks so precisely that they fit without mortar.
You once saw a man shave down a slab with a chisel and rasp for 3 hours just to make sure it nested perfectly with the one below. When he was finished, he stepped back, ran his hand across the seam, and nodded. No one applauded. The next stone arrived immediately. He started again. Even lifting, the roughest of jobs, requires subtlety. Knowing how to balance a load across your shoulders to protect your spine. How to turn a cart around on a narrow path without spilling its contents. How to keep a crane's ropes from twisting in the wind. These things aren't written down. They're passed between backs, learned through bruises. It's strange. The more you work, the more you notice how knowledge rises from the bottom. How the best crews are the ones who talk little, adjust silently, anticipate problems before they appear. How experience doesn't shine, it hides, in silence, in instinct, in the extra layer of clay no one asked for.
Sometimes a new engineer arrives, fresh from Rome, with scrolls under his arm and polished sandals. He inspects the site, asks questions, gives orders. You nod, you do as told. But when he leaves, the men around you exchange glances, and then they fix what needs fixing, quietly, efficiently. The work doesn't follow the plan follows the work. And yet, when the governor visits, he thanks the architect. That's how it is. The empire praises the vision, but it stands on the hands that never wrote it. In the evenings when you sit by the fire, chewing dry bread and rubbing your wrists, you hear talk not of theory, but of practice. Someone tells a story about a collapsed grain silo, not with blame, but with analysis. What went wrong? How to avoid it next time? These conversations are slow, deliberate, practical, and often more precise than anything written in Latin on vellum. You start to realize something, that the buildings that last, the ones that stand after centuries, were not just the product of design, but of intuition. They held because someone with cracked fingers and a quiet mind saw something the drawings missed, because someone who had never studied geometry felt the balance of a dome before it tipped. The next day you return to the trench. Same tools, same sweat. But as you smooth out the gravel, you make a small change, a slight curve in the edge, just enough to channel water away. No one will notice, but you do it anyway, because sometimes the smartest thing in Rome is buried just beneath the dirt. Imagine yourself standing beside a pit of black sand, watching as it slowly mixed into lime and water by hand. The motion is circular, rhythmic, unbroken. The sand turns the water dark, almost muddy, and soon the mixture begins to steam faintly. It's not hot, Not exactly, but it feels alive. You step back. This is Pozzolana, and what you're watching is the beginning of something most people won't understand, even 2,000 years later. Roman concrete was not like today's concrete. It didn't come in neat grey bags, and it didn't harden in hours, and it didn't crumble after a few decades. What the Romans made could set under water, resist centuries of weathering, and still hold shape long after the names carved into it were forgotten. The secret was pozzolana, a volcanic ash found in abundance near the Bay of Naples. From a distance it looked like ordinary dust. Up close it felt heavier, drier, more reactive. When mixed with lime and crushed stone, it created something no other civilization had reliably developed: hydraulic concrete. You first encountered it on a harbor project, a long, low seawall meant to protect ships from waves near Cossa. The foundation had to be poured below the tide line. You assumed this meant failure, but the engineers, calm and precise, showed you how to layer pozzolana with slaked lime and rubble into wooden molds submerged in the sea. Over days, the mixture hardened, not weakened, underwater. It didn't wash away. It became solid, smooth, permanent. The ash reacts with water and lime to form crystals that bind over time. It doesn't just dry. It cures slowly, deeply. You could feel it hardening even days after pouring. The material was heavy, yes, but also flexible in its uses. It could fill gaps in stonework, support arches, serve as flooring, even rise as the base of domes.
There was a kind of reverence for it among experienced builders. Not magic, just respect. Because pozzolana turned a process once dependent on careful stone cutting into something new: mass construction. Suddenly, walls didn't need to be carved block by block. They could be poured, molded, adjusted. The building itself became more fluid, and where stone had once dictated form, now the mixture followed imagination. You worked once on a storage cistern in a hot inland region, far from the volcanic heartland. Pozzolana was shipped in sacks by mule caravan, each bag guarded like treasure. Without it, the structure would crack and leak in the first rains. With it, the tank held water for generations. The cost was high, the delays frequent, but the result, a cool, silent chamber that never dripped, was worth every coin. There were other mixes, of course. Builders experimented with proportions: more lime, less ash, different aggregate sizes. The more experienced ones could adjust based on humidity, season, or use. You learned by feel, by the sound of the trowel in the mix, by how the surface shone when smoothed. You could always tell when someone got the ratio wrong. It smelled off. It dried with hairline fractures. The surface flaked under touch. And then there was the color. True pozzolana concrete had a muted, almost chalky tone. Not grey, not white, something in between. You'd run your palm over it and feel heat long after the sun had faded, as if it remembered. Modern engineers, you've heard, try to replicate the Roman mix, but something's missing. Maybe it's the exact mineral composition of the ash. Maybe it's the curing environment, humidity, layering, time. Maybe it's the way the materials were handled, mixed slowly by hand, not churned in metal drums. Whatever the case, nothing today lasts the way those old walls do.
The Pantheon is the great example, of course. Its dome, the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, still stands, still defies logic. And beneath that perfect curve is layer after layer of volcanic ash and lime, rising lighter as it ascends. The engineers knew to vary the composition. Heavier stones at the base, lighter pumice and pozzolana near the top. The whole thing is less like a sculpture and more like a recipe, one you never quite see, only taste through time. You sometimes wonder how many of these secrets were truly understood, how many were passed down intentionally, and how many simply mimicked. So much knowledge in Rome wasn't written, it was lived, felt in the hands, repeated until instinct took over. You've met older builders who never studied a diagram in their lives, but who could tell you exactly how to lay a pozzolana mix to prevent cracking near a corner. You've watched a man smooth a vertical surface so cleanly that it reflected the sunrise the next morning, not because it had to, but because it could. And when a wall fails, which sometimes happens, it is never the pozzolana that's blamed. It is the haste, the shortcuts, the substitutions, the rush to pour without pause. Roman concrete taught you patience, that time is part of the material, that curing isn't just drying, it's becoming. Even now, as you walk past the older structures, the ones that don't crumble when you push on them, you run your hand along the surface and feel something strange. Not softness, not strength, but memory. The sand remembers the fire it came from. The water remembers the hand that stirred it, and the wall somehow remembers that it was meant to last. Imagine yourself walking into a building so quiet it seems to hold its breath. The floor beneath your feet is cool and precise, polished stone in concentric patterns. Above you, far above, there's an opening in the ceiling, perfectly round. Daylight spills through it like a column of dustless air. You look up and realize you are standing beneath the largest unreinforced concrete dome in history, and there are no cracks, no supports, nothing holding it up except gravity, mathematics, and something else you can't quite name. This is the Pantheon, built almost 2,000 years ago, still standing, still complete. Its dome stretches over 43 meters in diameter, wider than most modern cathedrals, larger than most sports arenas. And it was made without steel, without iron beams, without the technologies we now consider essential. The dome's survival isn't just impressive, it's unsettling, because it works, and we still don't fully understand how. You worked once on a temple dome, nothing so grand, a quarter the size, maybe less. The scaffolding alone took months. The mortar had to be mixed and poured by hand, each layer cured before the next could be placed. And still, even with care, it cracked near the top. The weight pulled inward, the walls bowed slightly. Reinforcements were added. The building held, but only just. And yet, the Pantheon dome holds. It doesn't creak in the wind. It doesn't shift with earthquakes. It doesn't even seem to age. You know the technical explanations. The graduated mix of materials. Heavier concrete at the base. Lighter pumice and volcanic ash near the top. The use of coffers, sunken panels in the ceiling that reduce weight without weakening the structure. The hidden tension rings, the thick drum walls. The oculus at the center, relieving pressure. But even knowing these things, the effect remains. It shouldn't work, but it does. They say the dome was poured in place, layer by layer, using timber formwork and precisely timed curing. The Romans had no cranes capable of lifting such mass. So instead, they built the sky downward, moulding each level like a rising bowl, each meter carefully balanced against the next. Time was the main ingredient. Time and trust. Trust in pozzolana. Trust in gravity. Trust in the unspoken knowledge of those who mixed and lifted and smoothed. You imagine being one of those workers, standing on the wooden formwork, hundreds of feet above the ground, spreading the final layers of concrete. There is no margin for error. The shape must be exact. the mixture consistent. The curve must hold its own weight as it rises. There are no second chances. And yet, the result isn't rigid. It breathes. The dome expands slightly in summer, contracts in winter. The oculus, the central hole at the top, lets in rain, yes, but also sunlight, stars, time itself. The building is not sealed. It's open, like a lung. And inside you feel small, not crushed, but humbled. There's no decoration that overpowers the space, no sculpture that draws attention away from the shape. It is the architecture that speaks, and it speaks quietly.
You've visited later domes, imitations, variations, reinventions. Some collapse after decades. Others last longer, but show cracks. The Pantheon does neither. It doesn't even seem to notice the centuries. And that raises the question, was it built too well? There's a theory whispered among older builders that some Roman structures lasted longer than anyone intended, that they were meant to stand for a century or two, not 2,000 years, that the perfection of form and material was an accident of intuition and patience, not of over-design. You don't know if that's true, but you know this: no one you've met has ever worked on something so complete, so calm, so balanced. There are no seams in the Pantheon dome, no weak points, no joints that betray stress. It is a single, continuous pour, or at least it appears that way. And perhaps that illusion, that unity, is what keeps it standing. When rain falls through the oculus, it splashes onto a floor precisely angled to drain it away. Nothing puddles, nothing stains. Even water, the slow destroyer of all stone, is part of the plan. You wonder what it felt like the day it was unveiled, when Hadrian, or whoever truly commissioned its final version, stepped beneath the dome and looked up. Did they feel awe, or did they see it as a tool, a temple, a symbol, a demonstration of empire? And did the men who built it understand what they had done? You hope they did. You hope someone, some mason, some laborer, stood back at sunset, hands covered in dust, and whispered to no one in particular, "This will still be here when I am gone." And they were right.
Imagine yourself standing on a stone platform at the edge of the sea, the wind tearing at your tunic and the salt clinging to your lips. You look down and see blocks of concrete submerged beneath the waves, not broken, not scattered, but placed with care. They've been there for decades, maybe longer, and yet they still hold. You know because you helped place them, and because they are still dry inside. Roman harbors weren't just built, they were imposed. on coastlines, on tides, on geography that refused to cooperate. Nature rarely offers calm water, deep enough for large ships protected from storms, but the empire required access to grain, to timber, to marble, to war. And so the Romans did what seemed impossible. They built the coastlines they needed. You worked once at Caesarea Maritima, a harbor project larger than anything you'd seen before. The sea there was treacherous, with sudden currents and deep drops. But that didn't stop the project. It only slowed it. Timber caissons were constructed on land, huge wooden boxes, sealed at the bottom, and then floated out to sea. There they were filled with a special mix of volcanic ash, lime, and rubble, hydraulic concrete. Once submerged, the concrete hardened, forming artificial reefs, seawalls, docks. The mix was poured underwater, not by divine power, but by pozzolana, the same volcanic dust used inland, now applied against the tides. The result was unlike anything you'd imagined. The blocks settled into place and didn't move, not with waves, not with wind, not with time. Some structures were sunk stone by stone. Others were pre-assembled in sections and lowered by crane. Giant machines mounted on barges with pulleys creaking and ropes straining as ton after ton of material disappeared into the sea. Divers working by touch guided placement. They tied themselves to rocks so the current wouldn't carry them away. You remember the look in their eyes when they came up, red, swollen, but satisfied. The scale of these harbors was vast. Moles stretching for hundreds of meters, breakwaters curving like arms into the sea, lighthouses built on artificial islands. You saw maps of them, ink on wax tablets, with circles and lines you barely understood, but the meaning was always the same. Extend land into water. Make nature obey. You'd assumed salt would destroy the concrete, that the sea would find its way in and eat away at the core, but it didn't. Pozzolanic concrete, once cured, seems to grow stronger in salt water. The minerals react over time, forming compounds that reinforce the mix, like coral around bone. You remember digging into one of the older docks, a repair project. The concrete was pale and smooth, shot through with veins of crystal. It looked less like something built and more like something born. The harbor wasn't just for ships, it was for power. Traders arrived daily, wheat from Egypt, spices from the east, soldiers on their way to Gaul, slaves, messages, statues of emperors. The harbor became the empire's throat, through which all things passed. But harbors also needed defense. You helped construct a seawall once, lined with sharpened wooden stakes driven into the seabed, tips coated in tar. Behind them, a line of submerged stones, positioned just low enough to shatter the hull of any enemy boat. At high tide, they vanished from view. At low tide, they gleamed like teeth.
It wasn't just strength. It was planning. Some ports had systems to flush out silt using diverted river flow. Others had sluices carved into the dockside to allow for drainage, cleaning, or repairs. Engineers argued over gradient and depth. You watched them drop pebbles into still water and measure the ripples. Their tools were simple: rods, strings, lead weights. But their minds were focused, precise. When a harbour was finished, it didn't just function, it announced. A Roman port was a statement that the empire had reached this place, tamed this coast, and would not retreat. You remember one night during a storm when waves broke against the breakwater you'd helped build. The wind howled, lightning split the sky, but inside the protected basin, the water barely moved. Ships bobbed gently. Lanterns flickered, but did not go out. The harbour had worked. And as the years passed, ships changed, empires shifted, but the foundations remained. Divers still find them today, covered in algae, but intact. The outlines of ancient docks visible from the air. Stone underwater that shouldn't still be there, but is. Some say the recipe is lost, that we don't know how the Romans made such concrete, that we lack the ash, or the time, or the knowledge. Maybe. Or maybe we've just stopped believing that anything is worth building to last 2,000 years. You've touched that stone. You've placed it with your hands. You've watched the sea fail to move it. And now, when you stand at the edge of a modern harbour, steel pylons rusting, concrete blocks cracking at the joints, you feel something strange. Pride and pity, because once men like you built against the sea and won.
Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a crumbling overpass. Pieces of concrete litter the ground beneath it. Exposed rebar rusts in the rain. The surface, once flat, is flaking into powder. This bridge was built 40 years ago, and already it's dying. Not from fire or earthquake, just from time. You think back to a Roman aqueduct you saw years ago, long abandoned, no longer carrying water, but still standing. Its arches perfect, its surface weathered but solid. No steel, no epoxy, just stone, lime, volcanic ash, and patience. and it hits you. We've forgotten something. Modern concrete is strong, in theory. It sets quickly. It's cheap to produce. It allows for speed and scale. But it also cracks. It swells with moisture. It corrodes from the inside out when reinforced steel begins to rust. Most modern concrete structures are designed with a lifespan in mind. 50 years, maybe 100 if maintained. But Roman concrete, some of it is nearly 2,000 years old, and it hasn't even noticed. You remember the process. Roman builders mixed lime, volcanic ash, especially pozzolana, and aggregates like crushed tile or stone. The result was not instant. It didn't harden in a day. It cured, slowly, deeply, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer. But once set, it didn't just resist water, it used it. Salt water strengthened it. The minerals reacted over time to create dense, interlocking crystals, closing gaps, self-healing tiny fractures. Modern mixes, by contrast, are often over-engineered on paper but underwhelming in the field. They rely on additives, accelerants, and steel reinforcement to hold form under pressure. But once cracks begin, and they always do, water enters, steel rusts, expansion begins, and decay becomes inevitable.
You worked once on a restoration crew for an old Roman cistern. The outer walls had been damaged by excavation, but the core, the part made with pozzolanic concrete, was untouched, still watertight, still cold to the touch. You chipped at it with a hammer and stopped. It felt wrong, like breaking a promise. Engineers debate endlessly about why we can't replicate the Roman mix. Some blame the materials. Modern lime is different, they say. The ash we use isn't from Vesuvius. Our aggregates are too uniform. Others say the process is the problem. We pour too fast, cure too hot, reinforce too heavily. But deep down, you suspect it's something else, something simpler. Time. Roman builders didn't rush. They didn't need their walls to cure overnight. They worked in phases, let foundations sit for days before adding weight. They designed for endurance, not for budget cycles. And because they weren't chasing deadlines measured in quarters, they left behind structures measured in centuries. You also suspect intent plays a role. When a Roman poured a foundation, he expected it to outlive him, outlive his children, perhaps even his city. The modern world builds differently. Functionally, yes, but temporarily. Nothing is meant to last. Roads are patched, bridges replaced, towers demolished. The permanence of architecture has become a fiction.
There's a saying among masons: fast concrete cracks forever, slow concrete cures forever. You've seen builders pour modern slabs that begin crumbling at the edges within a year. You've seen concrete columns sprayed with sealants every 5 years, just to keep water from tearing them apart. And yet Roman sea walls still stand, submerged in tides that have eaten through steel and stone alike. One of the engineers you once worked with had a theory. He believed Roman concrete worked because it was treated like stone, not like a fluid. It wasn't poured to fill a shape. It was built as part of a whole, layered, placed, coaxed into permanence, not forced.
You wonder if we'll return to that. If we'll someday stop measuring strength in compression ratings and start measuring it in years survived. Maybe not. Maybe progress means speed now, efficiency, replacement. But still, there's something strange in watching a modern structure die, while a Roman one remains. You walk past an apartment block built in the 1960s. Hairline cracks spider down the walls. Chunks have fallen from the facade. You glance down at the sidewalk and see the damage roped off with caution tape. Then you visit an old Roman warehouse, roofless but strong, the floor still level, the walls still plumb. No steel, no tension cables, just old ash, old hands, and the memory of how to wait. What the Romans knew wasn't a secret, it was an attitude. Build slowly, build honestly, build for someone you'll never meet. And maybe, just maybe, it will still be here long after you've forgotten what it was for.
Imagine yourself standing beside a shallow stone channel, staring at a stream of water that moves so slowly it almost appears still. But it's flowing, exactly as it should, not spilling, not pooling, not rushing. You dip your hand into it, cold, clean, controlled. You look around. There are no pumps, no engines, no gauges. Just slope, just gravity, just Rome. The Roman aqueducts didn't roar with water, they whispered. A system built not on force, but on precision, invisible to most, but essential to all. That water made the cities live. It bathed the emperor, filled the fountains, washed the streets, fed the public baths, cooled the wine, and watered the courtyards. And it all worked because someone, long ago, calculated a slope so slight,
so patient it moved mountains without disturbing a leaf. You've stood on construction sites where engineers debated fractions of degrees. A drop too steep and the water would erode the channel, break stones, crash through towns. Too flat and it would stagnate, go foul, breed disease. The ideal, about 1 in 500, 2 centimeters per meter, invisible to the eye, but powerful enough to carry life across miles. They didn't have lasers or GPS or digital levels. They had strings, lead plumb lines, wooden frames, buckets of water. The corrobates, a long leveling tool with a narrow water channel carved into it, could detect tiny shifts in slope over distance. By watching how the surface tension of the water behaved, tilted ever so slightly, they knew whether the ground was true. You remember your first time using one. The bench was 5 meters long, awkward, heavy. You placed it on uneven terrain outside of town. Wind rocked it, dust filled the trough. But after an hour of adjustments, the water settled, the bubble disappeared, and you knew the truth of the ground beneath your feet.
Surveyors walked for days, sometimes weeks, to chart a line for an aqueduct. They followed the terrain with gentle stubbornness, refusing steep drops, carving tunnels when needed, building arcades where the valleys opened wide. You saw once the plans for an aqueduct that stretched nearly 80 kilometers from spring to city. Its elevation dropped less than 20 meters. Think of that. 80 kilometers across hills, forests, valleys, and villages, and the water still flowed, silently, evenly, without fail. The math wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the land itself. Obstacles everywhere, soft soil, seasonal floods, private farms, old ruins, buried rock. You watched crews dig test trenches for days, only to adjust the course by a few degrees, because a slope changed subtly beyond the next ridge. And yet, the system worked. Even underground, the slope had to be exact. In tunnels with no light, you relied on feel, on trust in your tools, on repeated measurements. Every few meters you stopped, checked, adjusted, again and again. And when one team tunneled from one side and another team from the other, they met, within centimeters. You remember standing at the junction point, underground, torchlight flickering against damp stone, the channel lined up perfectly. A stream of water began to trickle through, winding its way to a city that didn't even know it had just been saved. It wasn't just the slope, it was the constancy of it, the refusal to allow error. You learned quickly that the channel must never rise, never flatten. Water won't climb. It barely tolerates hesitation. Any bump in the grade meant backflow,
pressure points, failure. So you shaved stone, layered mortar, measured again, always again.
Sometimes the aqueduct emerged into the light, elegant arcades leaping across valleys on tiers of stone. Tourists today admire them for their symmetry, their grandeur, but to you they were extensions of slope, form following function. The arch wasn't art, it was necessity to keep the angle true. Even the smallest detail mattered. The width of the channel, the smoothness of the walls. Algae slowed flow, debris diverted it. You knew which tiles to use, which surfaces to burnish, which maintenance paths to leave alongside for future repair. People today see stone, they imagine simplicity, but what they miss is the discipline, the quiet, methodical obsession with precision. That is what moved the water. You've heard engineers joke that the Romans didn't understand hydraulics, that they didn't calculate flow rates the way we do now. And maybe that's true. But what they did know was practice, outcome. If the water flowed, the theory didn't matter. In some ways, they were right. You once visited a site where the aqueduct was over 1,000 years old, broken in places, repaired in others, but still running. The channel curved around hills, crossed ravines, dipped beneath fields, and through it all it kept its slope, quietly, faithfully, like a promise. That's what Roman engineering understood. Not just how to build, but how to build with patience. Because the greatest power in Rome wasn't concrete or arches or even conquest. It was slope, invisible, unshakable, and perfectly measured. Imagine yourself walking beside a narrow stone channel that hugs the hillside like a scar. You follow its path for hours, until the forest thins and the ground dips, revealing arches in the distance. Stone stacked upon stone, stretching across the valley like a bridge for the sky. Water flows quietly through the top. You can't see it, but you know it's there. The city below depends on it, and it always arrives. Rome never trusted wells alone, not in cities, not for millions. The empire didn't leave water to chance. It captured springs in the hills, miles away from chaos, and brought them home with unbroken patience. Over time, this became more than a practice. It became a system, a network, a circulatory structure that fed the urban body like blood.
You once worked near the Anio Valley, east of Rome. There, 4 aqueducts ran parallel, each older than the last. Water from different sources, different elevations, different ages. One carved directly into the rock, another raised high on arches, crossing over the first like a second story in stone. The result? Choice, redundancy, control. The water didn't flow to a single pipe. It was divided, slowed, redirected, filtered. Settling tanks removed silt. Holding basins regulated pressure. At every step, someone had considered the details. What to do if a branch overflowed, if a source dried up, if the city demanded more. Rome wasn't just supplied, it was managed. You learned that water was categorized. Some aqueducts delivered potable water. Others fed baths, fountains, or industrial sites. Certain springs were reserved for temples. Even the most sacred places had their own pipelines hidden beneath marble, leading to altars where water shimmered in shallow pools.
Each villa, each district, each fountain had a designated quota, and each was marked by inscriptions, taps, and valves. The aquarii, water clerks, walked the lines, checked for leaks, unauthorized diversions, illegal taps. They carried keys to locked gates in the conduits. They kept Rome flowing. You once assisted an Aquarius on a repair. The channel had cracked near a turn, seeping slowly into the hillside. It hadn't failed yet, but the pressure drop was enough to concern the bathhouses downstream. Together you cleared the blockage, patched the mortar, tested the slope. It took most of a day, but by sunset the level had stabilized. The water never stopped. That was the rule. The water must never stop. You remember walking through Rome and hearing it, the background sound of empire, water in motion, trickling from lion head fountains, splashing into cisterns, flowing beneath the streets. The Cloaca Maxima carried the excess away, down, always down, out toward the Tiber, where it rejoined the current and forgot the marble. Visitors thought Rome was loud with voices. You thought it was loud with water. The numbers still astonish. Over 400 kilometers of aqueduct lines served the city at its peak. Some sources estimate over 1 million cubic meters of water entered Rome every day. Per person, that's more than many modern cities manage now. And it wasn't done with pumps or pressure valves, just slope, stone, intent. The supply made everything else possible. Public baths, latrines, sewer flushing, garden irrigation, industrial workshops, and pleasure. Fountains that served no purpose but sound, basins that cooled courtyards, water clocks, decorative pools,
Luxury was possible because necessity had been mastered.
But there was also hierarchy. Not everyone had equal access. The elite homes connected directly to pressurized lead pipes, private flow at the pull of a valve. Others fetched water from fountains. Some bathed in public, and some waited in line. The water's movement reflected power. You heard of senators who bribed aqueduct inspectors to divert more flow to their estates. You heard of temples that petitioned the emperor directly to claim a spring as holy. Water wasn't just a resource, it was politics. And yet, for all its complexity, the system was deeply human. People built it. People walked it. People understood it, not with formulas, but with experience. You met one old man, bent, silent, eyes always watching the ground. He'd spent 40 years maintaining a 5-kilometer stretch of aqueduct north of the city. He didn't speak much, but he knew every joint, every crack, every slope. When a leak began, he didn't need tools. He needed time and string and silence. He said something once, barely above a whisper. If the water is late, the city notices. You remember that, because it was true. The city breathed with water. Without it, the forums emptied, the baths cooled, the latrines clogged. Cleanliness vanished. Comfort vanished. Empire vanished. Rome didn't just build roads to connect land, it built channels to connect life. And when those channels failed, Rome trembled. That was the genius, not just the engineering, but the awareness that water was civilization, and that civilization had to flow.
Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a stone tunnel, the air damp and heavy with the smell of earth and rot. Below you, water moves, dark, fast, unbothered by what it carries. You toss a small twig in and watch it vanish down the current. It doesn't swirl. It doesn't hesitate. It simply leaves. The city breathes out through this channel. This is the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, and it's older than most temples. People speak of Rome's glory, the forums, the domes, the aqueducts, but few mention the system beneath their feet. Yet without it, the rest would fail. Water that arrives must also depart. Comfort creates waste. Density requires escape. And so the Romans built one of the most sophisticated drainage systems in the ancient world, not out of pride, but out of necessity. You first saw the Cloaca Maxima as a teenager, assigned to a repair crew clearing blockage after heavy rains. You expected chaos. You expected smell. You got both. But what surprised you more was the structure. Stone vaults so wide you could walk through them upright. Arched ceilings, seamless joints, carved gutters lining the sides to separate solids from flow. This wasn't just a ditch.
It was a designed artery. The sewer began centuries before the empire, during the time of kings, built first to drain the marshes between Rome's hills. Over time, it evolved, absorbed smaller drains, became a spinal cord beneath the urban sprawl. You saw maps of it later, a branching system reaching through every district, public latrines connected to it, street runoff, even some baths. Every excess found its way here. You remember how the water never stopped. Even in drought, the cloaca flowed, fed by aqueduct overflow and diverted springs, and not sluggishly. It moved with speed. That was key. The gradient, carefully maintained, ensured constant motion. Stagnation was the enemy. Moving water meant less smell, less disease, less decay. The engineering was subtle. The channel curved gently around foundations. Its ceiling was vaulted, not flat, preventing collapse, resisting pressure. Maintenance shafts were placed at intervals. You climbed down one once, using iron rungs slick with moisture. At the bottom, you found a silence so complete it felt sacred. Latrines emptied into it, not crude holes, but full stone benches with running water beneath. A sponge on a stick, the terzorium for cleaning. Not glamorous, but functional. Clean by the standards of the time, cleaner than much of the world would be for another 1,000 years. And it wasn't just elite homes or temples. Even insulae, apartment blocks, had connections to the sewer. Crude, sometimes indirect, often illegal, but the need was universal. You once spoke with a cloacarum curator, an official in charge of sewer oversight. His job wasn't celebrated. No statues, no speeches, but he walked the tunnels monthly, checked the flow, inspected walls for settling, cleared silt when needed. He spoke of flow rate the way others spoke of poetry. He said something you never forgot. If the city smells, it is already dying. And so it didn't, because the system worked. The smell was minimal. Rain cleaned the streets. The sewers carried the rest. Rome didn't wait for waste to become unbearable. It sent it away before anyone noticed. That was the genius. Preemption.
Modern cities often struggle with waste. Too many people, too few pipes, too little space. Rome designed for scale from the beginning. The tunnels were overbuilt, the flow overestimated, because growth was expected. Density was inevitable. You've seen sewers in other cities, cramped, shallow, easily overwhelmed. The cloaca, by contrast, welcomed pressure. It could flood and survive.
It had done so countless times. There were superstitions, of course. Some believed spirits lived in the tunnels. Offerings were thrown in, coins, tokens, sometimes animal bones. Once you found a small carved idol half submerged in sludge. You cleaned it, left it on a ledge. The next day it was gone. And there were darker moments. Sometimes bodies were found. Not many, but enough to remind you that the underworld had layers. Drunks, criminals, unfortunates who slipped or were pushed. The cloaca didn't care. It accepted everything. But even that brutal neutrality was part of its design. The sewer didn't judge. It carried. And in doing so, it protected. You learned to respect it. The quiet curve of the ceiling, the way moss grew only on one side, the way the air changed with the seasons. You knew its rhythm, and in some strange way it knew yours. At night, back above ground, you'd walk home past fountains, clean water gurgling in marble basins. Tourists would marvel, but you would look down at the grates in the street, the little vents, the places where the cloaca breathed, and you'd think, that's the reason you can enjoy the rest. Because the beauty of Rome, the comfort, the scale, the health, wasn't just built above, it was secured below.
Imagine yourself stepping into a public bath just before noon. The air is thick with warmth and moisture. Stone floors glisten beneath your feet. Light filters in through high, narrow windows, catching the rising steam in pale golden rays. Around you, men speak in low voices. Some sit in pools, others recline on benches. One pours water from a bronze jug into a shallow basin. You haven't paid. Entry is free today, as it often is. You came not to bathe, but to belong. In Rome, water was never just water. It was space, ritual, access, power. It wasn't confined to pipes and sewers and aqueducts. It filled courtyards, flowed through atriums, pooled in fountains, echoed in marble rooms. It was woven into daily life, from the private to the public, the mundane to the sacred. You came to the baths often, not just for cleanliness, though that mattered, but for rhythm, the sequence, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium, warm, hot, cold. The body responded, muscles relaxed, skin softened, pores opened and closed like clockwork. Some men came to talk politics, others to play dice, some just to sit in silence, soaking, as if the water absorbed what words could not. The water had already traveled miles, down slopes, through tunnels, past gates. It entered the bath complex through cisterns, massive domed chambers that regulated pressure and temperature. Fires beneath the floors heated it. A hypocaust system channeled warm air through hollow bricks. Engineers and slaves kept the machinery running. You rarely saw them, but you felt their presence in the constant hum of heat.
Rome's baths weren't private luxuries. They were urban infrastructure. Cities competed over them. Emperors funded them. Architects boasted of them. The baths of Caracalla could host over 1,600 people at once. Lavish mosaics, sculptures, libraries, gardens. But smaller towns had them too, scaled down but structured the same. Water, heat, order. And the water had to keep moving. Stagnation was unacceptable. Pipes were flushed. Pools were drained and refilled. Inspectors walked the channels with tablets and styluses, recording flow rates, testing valves, noting repairs. There was an entire bureaucracy just for water, the curatores aquarum, water commissioners who managed not only the infrastructure, but the flow of influence. You once saw a minor dispute escalate to a formal petition. A villa's private pipe allegedly diverting too much water from a public fountain. The inspection took days. Measurements were made. Stones were unearthed to reveal hidden lines. Eventually, the pipe was sealed, not because it was illegal, but because it broke the balance. Rome ran on fairness, or at least the appearance of it. Even religion took part. Temples had sacred springs. Vestal virgins tended to eternal flames fed by purified water. Certain holidays required ritual washing. Some sacrifices were only valid if the priest's hands had been cleansed with flowing water, not stagnant. You began to notice how people moved differently when water was near. Children played by fountains. Old men leaned on basins as they talked. Vendors used runoff from aqueduct outlets to cool their goods. Everything flowed, from news to wine to laughter, but it always followed the water. At home, if you were lucky enough to live in a domus, your atrium had an impluvium, a shallow pool that collected rain. Decorative, yes. Functional, always. Some were lined with lead, others with marble, and always the sound of dripping, a metronome for the quiet hours.
For those who lived in insulae, crowded apartment buildings, access was more complicated. Water carriers moved through the streets, filling jars from public fountains. Some sold access, others shared. You watched arguments break out, especially during drought. Not violent, but sharp. Water, when limited, reveals character. Still, Rome tried to provide. Over 1,300 public fountains dotted the city at its peak. Some simple spouts, others sculpted masterpieces. They marked crossroads, markets, plazas. You could navigate the city by them. You could tell the hour by how long the queue was. And there were rules. Unauthorized taps were a crime. Tampering with valves, stealing from lead pipes, punishable by fine or worse. Water was public property, but regulated like gold. And gold, in many ways, it was. Because water wasn't just survival, it was dignity. To be clean, to be cooled, to be seen in the baths, not reeking in the alleys. That was citizenship. That was Rome. You once overheard a traveler from the provinces marvel at the fountains. He said, "In my town, we fetch water from a hole. Here, it sings to you." That stayed with you, because it was true. Rome made water visible, audible, present. It didn't hide its systems, it celebrated them. And in doing so, it reminded every citizen, every day, that they were part of something larger, flowing, structured, intentional. And when that flow stopped, when the pipes cracked, the fountains dried, the baths fell silent, that's when the city was no longer Rome. Because more than marble, more than columns, more than law or language, it was water that held everything together. Imagine yourself walking along a road so straight it seems to ignore the land entirely. Hills rise to the left and right, but the path does not bend. It cuts through stone, rides over marsh, spans ravines. It is not the easiest way forward, it is the most certain. You don't ask where it leads, because in Rome, all roads lead somewhere that matters. You first worked on a road crew in your 20s. The sun was high and the work was relentless. Digging, leveling, pounding, layer upon layer. Earth, gravel, lime, crushed stone, pavers. Each layer flattened by rollers pulled by oxen. At first, it seemed excessive, too thick, too structured for something as simple as walking. But then the rains came, and the road stayed dry. The genius wasn't just in the surface, it was in the substructure. Roman roads weren't built to accommodate weather,
They were built to ignore it. Drains carved into the shoulders, cambered surfaces to shed water, deep foundations to prevent frost heave and mud. You saw roads that had not been touched in 100 years, and yet they still held carts, armies, and markets as if they'd just been laid. Rome didn't build roads because it was rich. It became rich because it built roads. At first, they were for the legions. The Via Appia, queen of roads, stretched from Rome to Capua, and eventually to Brundisium. Soldiers could march faster than messengers. Supply trains moved with rhythm. Speed was security. Territory was measured not in land held, but in how quickly troops could reach it.
You remember watching a unit of legionaries moving along the Via Flaminia. Their pace was unbroken, 60 kilometers in a day. Their boots struck the pavers like clockwork. No slipping in mud, no wading through creeks. The road didn't just help them move, it made them inevitable. But the roads carried more than soldiers, taxes, orders, governors, news. A letter sent from northern Gaul could arrive in Rome within days, changing policy before rebellion could spread. Information moved faster than fear. That too was power. Milestones marked every Roman road, literal stones placed at regular intervals, carved with the name of the builder, the distance to Rome, and sometimes imperial pride. You passed many, some worn smooth by time, others defaced by politics. But each reminded you this was no mere path, it was declaration. You once helped repair a bridge outside Hispalis, the Roman name for Seville. The locals still called it Roman, though no one remembered who had built it. The foundation was solid, the pavers intact. You added drainage, replaced a few blocks, but the road itself needed no reinvention. It simply endured. You began to notice a pattern. Wherever a road reached, a city followed, then a market, then a fort, then a bath. Roads weren't just connections, they were seeds. Rome didn't invade, it arrived, on stone, with order, with law. And when rebellion stirred, roads worked both ways. You remember a village in the mountains that had refused Roman rule, isolated, defiant. But when the road was finished, Rome arrived with silence. No battle, no siege, just a road. And within months, trade, taxes, tribute. The stone changed minds faster than swords. It wasn't just the large roads. The secondary routes mattered just as much. Spur lines, branches, unpaved connectors. Everything mapped, everything maintained. A man could leave Britannia and walk to Judea without leaving Roman stone. And the roads weren't always visible. In cities, they blended into the grid, seamless with sidewalks and plazas. In the provinces, they cut through forest with eerie precision. In deserts, they shimmered with heat, pointing forward even when nothing else did. The work never stopped. Crews like yours were everywhere, repairing sinkholes, clearing debris, resetting pavers. Road maintenance was continuous, funded by the state, sometimes by wealthy patrons seeking honor. You saw one man donate a section of road repair in exchange for a statue. The statue crumbled within years. The road is still there. You started to think of the roads as the empire's bones, not its skin, not the shining marble or painted domes, but the skeleton beneath. Quiet, strong, without which nothing else could stand. And even now, centuries later, when you walk through parts of Europe, you still follow Roman roads. They've been paved over, widened, narrowed, renamed, but they're still there. Beneath the asphalt, beneath the cars, the same roots, the same logic. Because good strategy doesn't age. And when you see a straight line cutting across fields, towns, rivers, remember, it wasn't made to be admired. It was made to conquer.
Imagine yourself standing in the middle of a wide, empty field. There are no signs, no paths, just wind, dust, and the faint sound of birds somewhere in the distance. And yet, you know exactly where you are. You plant your surveying pole, align the cross arms of your frame, and squint through the hanging plumb lines. Strings tremble, shadows shift, then everything stills. A straight line emerges in your mind, invisible to the eye, but no less real. This is how Rome measured the world. Long before satellites, compasses, or paper maps, Rome laid out its cities and roads with quiet precision. Not by guessing, and not by divine inspiration, but through tools, routine, and relentless repetition. You didn't need to see the whole landscape. You just needed to know where to begin, and then where to go next. The primary tool was the gromer, a wooden cross mounted on a vertical pole with plumb lines hanging from its arms. It looked fragile, primitive even, but in the right hands it could draw perfect right angles, measure intersections, and guide straight roads over vast distances. You remember using one for the first time. It felt strange, like a child's toy. The strings swung freely in the breeze, and every movement seemed exaggerated. But with practice, you learned its language. When the lines stopped dancing, when they aligned with the markers set down the field, when everything went quiet, then you were ready. You'd found your axis. North became real. You carried wax tablets, measured steps, drove stakes into the ground at intervals. The dioptra, a kind of sighting instrument, helped measure elevation. You poured water into shallow troughs to find level ground, used knotted cords to estimate distance. You kept notes of slope, soil, obstacles. Every few dozen paces you stopped, checked again, repeated. The work was not fast, but it was certain. Rome didn't believe in approximate geography. When it built with intent. Colonies were laid out in grids, centuriation they called it, perfectly square plots aligned to the cardinal directions. You could walk a Roman town blindfolded and still know where you were by the rhythm of the corners. The centuriation system wasn't just about order, it was about control. Land ownership, taxation, irrigation, military organization, all tied to the grid. You once stood beside a terminus stone marking the corner of 4 farm plots. Its base was deep, its inscription faded, but no one dared move it. The gods of boundaries were not to be mocked. You've seen Roman boundary disputes argued with string and shadows. 2 men yelling over a trench dug years ago. A third arrives with a gromer, and within an hour the truth is found, not by opinion, but by geometry. When larger projects were needed, aqueducts, highways, urban walls, survey teams grew in number. You were part of one once, charting the extension of the Via Aemilia. The landscape was hostile, uneven, choked with undergrowth, occasionally impassable. But you cleared a path wide enough to stretch a rope, aligned your cross arms, took a bearing, then again, then again. By the time the engineers arrived, the path was ready, invisible but certain. They trusted the line because they trusted the method. Sometimes you surveyed for drainage, for sewers, for grain silos, for tunnels. You once laid the angle for a canal that saved an entire district from flooding. It took weeks. Most of that time was spent staring at bubbles in water troughs and shadows on stone. The ditch itself took 3 days to dig.
But that was Rome. 3 weeks to be sure, 3 days to build. You began to see the world differently. Slopes spoke to you. Curves betrayed intention.
You could tell when a city had been laid out with care, or when someone guessed. You walked through older towns and saw chaos. Then came a Roman colony. Clean lines, clean streets, clean thinking. You came to believe that surveying wasn't a task, it was a kind of philosophy. There was even ritual. Before measuring, you often stood still. Let your tools settle. Let the wind quiet. You waited for the strings to align on their own, without force. That moment, when the groma stilled, felt sacred, not religious, but precise. You once met a Greek philosopher who mocked your tools, said they were crude, said real knowledge came from the stars, from pure reason. You smiled and asked him to find due east on a foggy morning in the hills. He couldn't. You did. There were failures, of course. Lines drawn in error, trees not accounted for, curvature over long distance skewing alignment, but rarely, because the system corrected itself. Surveyors cross-checked one another, repeated measurements, drew temporary lines first, then tested them in practice. Rome didn't just build, it rehearsed. You sometimes think of the maps, the great ones, like the former Orbis Romae, a stone map of the entire city carved into marble, room by room, or the Tabula Peutingeriana, a rolled parchment showing the empire's entire road network, not to scale, not literal, but functional, mental, operational. The roads, the cities, the aqueducts, they didn't just appear. They were drawn first in the dirt, measured by shadow, checked by string, and then they became real. That's the lesson you never forgot. Rome didn't conquer with weapons alone. It conquered with lines.
Imagine yourself placing a final wedge of stone, the keystone, into the top of a curved frame. For a moment, nothing happens. Then the wooden supports creak, settle, and you remove the frame. The arch stands. It holds not because of magic, not because of strength, but because of shape. The stones press inward, not down, each one locked in by its neighbor. And suddenly, something that should fall stays. The Roman arch is everywhere, in aqueducts, in bridges, in temples, in gates, not because it's beautiful, though it is, but because it solved a problem that had plagued builders for centuries: how to span space without collapse. Flat beams break, heavy stones crack, but the arch redistributes weight.
It takes pressure and bends it inward. Curves, it turns out, are stronger than straight lines. You built your first arch in your early 30s. Not a great one. A small pedestrian bridge over a shallow stream. It took a week to shape the voussoirs, the wedge-shaped stones, and 2 days to set the formwork. When you pulled the frame away and the arch didn't move, you felt something strange. Not pride, not relief, something deeper, like witnessing a law of nature made visible. Roman builders didn't invent the arch, but they mastered it. They standardized its dimensions, calculated its limits, and learned how to multiply its effect. You saw it used to carry aqueducts across valleys, to hold up massive gates, to support multi-story buildings, even in sewers, hidden from sight. The arch carried weight for centuries.
You once repaired an arch that had been in service for over 500 years. The stones were worn, but the form was true. You replaced one block near the base, not because it failed, but because someone else had disturbed it. A small shift, a tiny imbalance, but the arch noticed. That's the secret. It's a system. Every part depends on the others. Remove one, and the rest trembles. You learned to recognize a good arch by sound. Tap the stone, listen to the ring. The keystone should be solid, the side stones resonant. If one tone is dull, the load isn't balanced. You adjust. You wait. You try again. There's no rushing it. And then there's the vault, the extension of the arch through space. Barrel vaults, groin vaults, domes. Once the Romans understood the arch, they began to stretch it, stack it, rotate it. The Pantheon's dome is nothing but an arch spun in a perfect circle. The Colosseum is rings of arches on top of arches, structure as repetition. Form followed function, but function followed understanding. The strength of the arch came not from the materials, but from the pattern. You saw bridges made from rough stone that held against floods, not because the stone was perfect, but because the shape was. The water rushed around the piers, but the arches held firm, pressing down and in, over and over again. Arches could fail, of course, if built poorly, if the foundations settled unevenly, if the span was too wide without reinforcement. But when they were built well and slowly, they lasted.
You began to see the world through curves. Straight lines looked brittle, temporary. A wall was just a wall, but an arch meant planning, calculation, intention. You saw how they changed space. An aqueduct arch wasn't just a structural choice. It elevated the channel above terrain, allowed the water to continue uninterrupted. It was grace born of logic. You walked once beneath a triumphal arch in a provincial town. The inscription had faded, the carvings were damaged, but the structure stood, unshaken. The passage framed by it felt different than an open street. It was a threshold, a reminder that someone had passed here, that someone had returned victorious. The message remained, even if the names had not. And even underground, the arch endured. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, is vaulted. You walked its length once, head bowed, torch in hand. The ceiling curved perfectly above you, holding back the weight of the city. Without mortar, without steel, just stone, just shape. Modern engineers still study Roman arches, replicate them in concrete, build steel skeletons around their form, but too often they forget why they worked. They thought it was strength alone. It wasn't. It was distribution, relationship, geometry, trust between pieces. You once explained it to a student like this: a good wall resists pressure. A good arch invites it. He didn't understand, not at first, but when he built one and watched it hold, something clicked behind his eyes. The curve had taught him. There is something eternal in that shape, something beyond style. You've seen arches buried in ruin, covered in vines, half collapsed, and still somehow proud, as if they remember what they once carried. An empire, perhaps, or just the knowledge that the right form can outlast everything around it.
Imagine yourself standing in the shadow of a Roman wall. You reach out and touch it. The surface is cold, worn smoothed by centuries of rain and wind. Your fingers find the faintest curve, a line barely visible, a shape long forgotten. There's no inscription left, no plaque, no record of who built it, but it still stands. You ask yourself how, and deeper still, why? We understand Roman engineering in fragments, in terms, in textbooks. We talk of pozzolana, aqueducts, arches, gradients, roads. We can measure, map, model. We can replicate, or try to. But there is a space between what we know and what they did, a silence between the drawings and the stone. And in that silence is something we've lost. Not entirely, but enough. Because for all our technology, many of their structures still outperform ours. Roman concrete lasts longer. Their roads endure beneath ours. Their sewers still function. Their domes still inspire awe. We see the outcomes, but we often fail to understand the thinking. Not the math, but the mindset. Roman builders didn't work for speed. They didn't pour by the hour. They didn't build for market demand or quarterly returns. They built for use, for legacy, and sometimes for eternity. They expected their work to be seen not in 5 years, but in 5 generations. And when they made mistakes, and they did, they learned slowly, cautiously. Repetition replaced innovation. You once heard a builder say, "The second dome is better than the first because we lived with the first."
Modern construction often forgets to live with what it makes. There are Roman bridges still carrying traffic. There are Roman ports still resisting the sea. There are Roman cities whose foundations guide modern streets. Their engineers worked with stone and string, but they built things we still depend on. And that should humble us, because it's not that we lack the tools. We have more. We have simulation software, steel alloys, chemical binders, digital survey equipment. What we lack is patience, restraint, continuity. We build fast, we build big, and then we build again. You once visited a modern stadium. Steel beams, glass roof, thousands of seats. A marvel by all accounts. And yet it already showed cracks, leaks, settling. Not even 15 years old. Then you stood in the Pantheon, quiet, still, unimpressed by time. The lesson isn't that old things are better. The lesson is that some things are worth building to last. But we also don't fully know how they did it. Not exactly. The recipes for Roman concrete were never fully standardized. The proportion of lime, ash, aggregate varied by region, by purpose, by instinct. Builders learned by doing, not from manuals, but from mentors, from stone, from failure. That kind of knowledge doesn't leave behind schematics, it leaves behind walls.
And sometimes that's all we have. You've walked through ruins where nothing remains but the footprint, the line of stones where a wall once stood. And yet, even that is enough to see the logic, to imagine the system,
to recognize the intelligence that once moved through it like water. Not divine, not mysterious, just quiet, persistent, human. The kind of intelligence that doesn't shout, that doesn't rush, that doesn't demand recognition, but that builds anyway and trusts the structure to speak for itself. We think of Rome as a place of grandeur, columns, emperors, armies. But the truth is, Rome was built by hands, by labor, by friction, by string lines and plumb bobs, and somewhere between that first chalk mark on dirt and the last stone on the arch, they achieved something we still chase, something lasting, not just materially, but intellectually, structurally, morally even, that if you build something with care, with logic, with patience, it will hold. You don't need to remember every name, every ruler, every law. You just need to stand beneath a dome that defies gravity, or walk a road that still leads somewhere, and you remember what's possible. And maybe, just maybe, you ask yourself, what will still stand from us? What structures will they find in 2,000 years? Will they still be holding? Will they still be useful? Or will they find cracks, not in the concrete, but in the intention? That's the final lesson Rome offers. Not how to pour a wall, but how to think like it matters.
So now, as the last echo of hammers fades, we step back from the arches, the roads, the domes, the water, and what remains? Not names, not triumphs, just structures. Built not for applause, but for function, for time. We've walked beneath bridges that outlived cities, touched walls that still resist the sea, followed roads that knew no doubt, and seen how knowledge, when buried deep enough in stone, survives forgetting. Rome didn't just build, it trusted what it built. And maybe that's the lesson, that what we leave behind says more than what we ever say aloud. Thank you for joining me tonight. This has been Boring Boris, Boring History for Sleep. Good night.